Thank you, ladies, for leading in worship. A doctor and a drummer. Man, multi-talented. So today is sermon number 7 in our sermon series on worship. But in fact, it's going to be the last one for now. I'm going to put this topic on pause for the summer, and I'm going to pick it back up in the fall. If we want to have a church-wide discussion on building a philosophy of worship, then I think we need to respect the time of year, make sure we do this when more people are more around more often. Since we've been jumping around to various scripture passages and subjects on worship, I thought it would make more sense to chop the sermon series into 2 big pieces instead of lots of little pieces through the summer. So today, we're going to look at a Bible passage that has really caught my attention over the years. It's a warning from God to His people, a warning that was so insightful that it predicted the activities of the people generations in advance. It was one of the original "I told you so" moments. Okay? You know what I mean by an "I told you so" moment, right? It's when one person warns the other, you shouldn't do this because if you do, something bad's going to happen. That person does the thing anyway. The bad thing is a result. And then the original person said, "See, told you so." It's like the time when I went quadding with my cousin on St. Joe's Island. My mom's here today. I'm pretty sure she knows which cousin I'm talking about. But I'm not going to name him because I don't want to throw Sean under the bus. Oh, man, I just let it slip, didn't I? Sean, if you're watching this on YouTube later, I apologize for mentioning your name, but thank you 13 years later for a sermon illustration. So my cousin and I had a chance to go quadding together on St. Joe's. It's actually called St. Joseph Island. Do you know where that is? It's up by Sault Ste. Marie. It's on the north tip of Lake Huron, just southeast of Sault Ste. Marie. It's a big island with 2 towns on it in that area of the country. So we had this chance to go quadding together, and you know a quad, right? You know what I'm talking about? It's like a motorcycle with the 4 wheels, so they're not tippy. They're very sturdy. They're strong. They've got the full 4-wheel drive. They got the 4 wheels that'll dig into the mud. There's guts behind the throttle. Fun to drive. Easy to get through anything. Pretty much go anywhere. Well, Sean and I put that go anywhere theory to the test this one day. So on the island, we ended up quadding around this shoreline of a swampy and shallow lake, and it was a blast. Water was about 6 inches deep, way out from the shore, and we were going full throttle and kicking up spray of water and lily pads in our wake. It was a lot of fun, messy afternoon. And that's when we saw this. I don't even know how to describe it except to say that it was a mud hole off to the side. And true to form, always the adventure seeker, my cousin Sean, he said, "Hey, we should try and go through the mud hole." Being the elder and wiser of the 2 of us, I said, "No way, you'll never make it. You're just going to get stuck in the middle of this mud pit, and then we're going to have to spend the whole afternoon trying to get you unstuck and get your machine cleaned up and be able to run again. In other words, don't do it or bad things are going to happen." That was my warning to Sean. Do you think he listened to me? No, he didn't listen to his older, wiser cousin. He went anyway. Tromps on the throttle, gets up a bit of speed, hits the mud, starts to lose speed, of course. That's going to happen. Starts to slow down. The wheels don't slow down. They're spinning away, right? Digging up, churning up mud that probably had not been disturbed since the beginning of time. And he's thrown this spray of mud and water and everything up into the air. And then finally his machine just started to slow down. But it kept going and going and going. And then it rose up a little bit and got itself up onto the shore, and he was on the other side. He was right and I was wrong, and I hated that. Then, of course, what's my responsibility next? I have to try, right? I have to take my turn. Now, in my defense, I think his run churned up the bottom and created ruts. The tracks were too deep. There I went. I hit the throttle just like him. I built up speed just like him. I slowed down in the muck just like him. I spun the tires and threw mud in the air just like him. But then I stopped, full on stopped, right there in the middle of the mud pit, and I was stuck. And instead of turning to him and being able to say, I told you so, I had to just shake my head at my own self and say, man, I knew that was going to happen. I should not have done that. It's amazing how often we convince ourselves to do something even when we know we probably shouldn't. We can sometimes predict it in our own behavior. We can sometimes predict it in the behavior of others, but not always. We can't always predict it. But in today's Bible passage, God predicts perfectly well that people will likely do the wrong thing, and he gives them plenty of warning. The scripture passage is in Deuteronomy. It's important that it's in Deuteronomy because the advice from God to his people here comes just after a significant episode in their history and just before he fulfills a remarkable promise for them. Okay? So the timing of when this warning comes is important. The history was this. Way back in the Old Testament days, the patriarch Jacob had a son, and that son's name was Joseph, not to be confused with Joseph, the husband of Mary, right? This was way before then. This Joseph was famous for another reason. God had a plan for this Joseph. God had told Joseph in a dream that he would be elevated to high status in society. In fact, he would be elevated to a status above his other 11 brothers. Well, he told his brothers that story in that dream that God gave him. And how did the brothers like that story? No, they didn't like it very much, right? No, we don't like that. We don't like this bragging that you're doing. And so in a jealous rage, the 11 conspired and they threw Joseph into a pit, actually with the intention of leaving him there for dead. But then they had a change of heart. Oh, you can't kill the guy. But only a slight change of heart, because what did they do instead? They sold him. Can you imagine that? They sold him. They sold him to this passing caravan that then took him to Egypt as a slave. In time and by miraculous circumstances that you can read on your own out of the Bible, Joseph rose to a position of prominence and trust in Egypt. And with miraculous insight from God, Joseph prepared in advance for a continent-wide famine that was to come. God had told him it was coming, and he prepared for it. And so in each year of that famine, Egypt had enough leftover food to sell to others. And that made the Pharaoh phenomenally wealthy. And having proven himself such a valuable asset to Pharaoh, Joseph was entrusted then with the administration of the entire country. In time then, his own family came to live with him in Egypt. His brothers, his father, everyone else in the family, they all came. And Joseph revealed his identity to them. And there was this big reunion. And they lived with him there in that country for hundreds of years. And that group was called the Israelites. Unfortunately, over time, Joseph and his brothers were now long dead, and the Egyptian kings who knew the contribution of the Israelites, those kings were also long gone. And the new Egyptian pharaohs now began to look at the Israelites not as previous saviors in a time of famine, but now they looked at them with suspicion, right? How come? Because now there's so many of them. And they've grown in prosperity, and they've grown in cultural strength right here in our own country. We better be suspicious of them. We better take preventive action lest they rise up against us. So they began to put the Israelites to work, forced labor. They became slaves in Egypt. God was not happy seeing his people become enslaved in Egypt. And so, God became angry at the Egyptians. And he sent Moses as a spokesperson to say to Pharaoh, "Let my people go. Just let them go." Pharaoh wouldn't listen. He didn't want to lose all the free labor, right? So then there came some of the most powerful and profound miraculous acts of the entire Bible. With the goal of saving the Israelites from slavery, God sent plagues. God killed the firstborn males of all the Egyptians. And God led his people across the Red Sea. And the miracles didn't stop there. What did God do for them in the desert? Do you remember? He gave them water out of the rock. He gave them food, manna, that just came down and was available for them to go collect. He gave them quail. When they complained about the food that God miraculously gave them, he gave them more food. He gave them meat, and they had that. And then he promised them even more. On the other side of the river, God said, on the other side of the river there is this land. The biblical phrase to describe the land was a land flowing with milk and honey. What does that conjure up? Images of plenty, right? Images of abundance. It means the land was prepared. Farms were already plowed. Cities were already established. Homes were already built. This wonderfully prepared land was ready to be their new home. Problem was, there's people already living there. They were called the Canaanites, but God knew what was coming. The Canaanites were this mix of people from several different cultures living in disobedience to God and affront to him. And so he was happy to push them out and have his homeless people take their place. And that's where God's warning comes in. After all they had been through, after all they had seen, after all God had done for them, and with this promise just on the horizon, I'm going to reread Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 11 to 20. That Grant read for us earlier. Deuteronomy 8, starting in verse 11. Here's what God says to his people after they've been through all of those miraculous events before they get to the promised land. He says, "Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply and your silver and gold is multiplied and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you to do you good in the end. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers as it is this day. And if you forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and serve them and worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you shall surely perish. Like the nations that the Lord makes to perish before you, so shall you perish, because you would not obey the voice of the Lord your God. That warning only makes sense if you remember that the promise has not yet been fulfilled. The promised land is still a few years away before they take possession. But even in that calm time before the storm, even as they wait for the starting pistol to fire, they receive this warning from God. When you get into this new land of plenty and abundance, when you live in houses you did not have to build and tend farms you did not have to plow, when life is good, do not forget your God. Why would they even need this warning? I mean, we just retold the whole story of their time and excursion in Egypt, the rescue out of it, all the miracles that happened there. They survived in the desert by miraculous food. Who could even dream or imagine that a people with such a history could ever forget? Why would they need a warning to not forget? Well, he gave them all that. He was going to give them all that stuff. They were right on the cusp of receiving it. And all that they had seen before, God still warned them, don't forget about me when you get there. Why would he have to say that? He had to say it because he knows the human heart has a phenomenal capacity to elevate itself, right? That's what we have. And especially, we elevate ourselves at the expense of God. We buy into arguments that plant seeds of doubt. And I've had many of these kinds of conversations with people as a pastor. One guy asked me, how do you know the Bible wasn't just invented by some guy and it's all a big hoax? Well, you know, if you actually look at archaeology with any kind of seriousness, you cannot draw that conclusion. But it was just enough of an argument in his own mind that it planted seeds of doubt that he himself lived a life that ignores God. Another guy one time asked me, how could all those miracles in the Bible be true? Well, if you look at how much of the world is yet unexplained, you have to be open to the possibility of miracles. But in that guy's mind, it was just enough seeds of doubt that he too lived a life that was void of God. Another guy one time asked me, how could a good God allow bad things to happen? And then he cited some event that happened back in his childhood. Well, if you recall that God sent his own son as an answer to the problem of evil in the world, you would understand his goodness and his power. But that issue on his mind was just enough to plant seeds of doubt that he felt free to live a life without acknowledging God. Another guy asked me, how could we believe our own Bible when there's so many other religions out there? Is it not arrogant to think that we have the only truth? Well, if you look at what the Bible itself says, it shows 11 followers of Jesus who in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus was arrested, what did they do? They did what? I heard it. They scattered and ran away. Is that an act of bravery? Is that an act of trust? Is that an act of, yes, this is what we believe sincerely? No, they ran. But then each one of them, to a man, in the end, was killed for their faith. So what changed? What turned them from chickens into faithful martyrs? Well, it's what happened in between. And what's their testimony? Their testimony is they saw the risen Jesus Christ. But that whole thought process of other religions was just enough of a seed of doubt in my friend's mind that he lived a life ignoring God. Knowing how ready the human heart is today to forget God, it's easy to imagine how the Israelites would forget their God, probably only months or years, certainly after generations, of being in the new promised land. Right? Imagine the conversations, imagine the thought process in the Israelites a few generations after being given the promised land, a few generations after their escape from Egypt. They would have thought things like this. How can we as a people really believe that Joseph did so well in Egypt? Isn't that just us exaggerating our own history and creating heroes out of nothing? How can we believe the story of the plagues and the splitting of the Red Sea? Is that not just revisionist history? How can we believe about the manna in the desert? Wasn't that just some natural phenomenon? How can we believe that God led us into the promised land? Did we not win that space ourselves with our own might and with our own military prowess? And that brings us to the heart of the issue. Of all the reasons that people use to belittle the work of God in the world, there is actually only one that is condemned today in our Bible story. Reread verse 17. Verse 17 is this. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. Beware lest you say that. Lest you look at everything around you and say, it is something that I did and something that I accomplished. It's that arrogance of humanity all over again. When my heart is willing to say, I accomplished this, then there is little room left for me to say, God accomplished this. I had a summer job one time burying telephone cable. Actually, it was my dad that got me the job. I was burying telephone cable for a summer. Not with a work crew and not with big machinery that did the digging for me, right? It was me with a shovel burying telephone cable about 4 inches into the ground from the box that's sort of at the end of the driveway by the road up to the house. That's what I was burying. Now in town, that was easy. You just create a little slit in the lawn, you stuff the cable down in, then you tromp it back together. Hardly even know that I was there, and you could do many yards of distance in a short amount of time. But some places were more difficult. This one I did was out in the country with this winding driveway about half a football field of length, and the yard was unkept, and so the area I had to work in was filled with rocks and roots and weeds and thistles and bushes and trees, and it was hot out. And when you're working in vegetation, when it's hot out, then it's all humid, right? And then there's mosquitoes and there's black flies and all this kind of stuff. Therefore, the work was much harder than in other places. And when I hit a rock, I had to dig it out. And when I hit a root, I had to chop it apart. And when I got to a shrub, I had to manage through it. It was pretty hard going. It went so slowly, in fact, that I had to take a whole second day to finish the job. I never took that long to go that kind of a distance, but at this place, I had to take a whole second day to get it done. But you know what? Once I was finished, I looked back and I said to myself, what a job well done, Daniel. I patted myself on the back. I worked stinking hard, and I deserved that sense of accomplishment. And you know what I didn't say? I didn't say, God, thank you for a job well done. Why not? Because I did the work, right? I deserve the credit. If anything, God kind of got in the way, right? It was His rocks. It was His roots. It was His mosquitoes. If it wasn't for that stuff, it would have been smooth sailing. The work would have been easy. You see how easy it is to begin to take credit for yourself and forget God's part. What is God's part? Well, every breath is a gift from Him, right? Because we hold that He sustains life. He gives us the strength to work. He gives us the health that we enjoy that others don't have. He gives us the provision of a job in the first place. So many things outside of myself have to come together before I can ever feel proud of how I manage a single shovel, right? But in the moment, we so easily forget. It's easy to steal credit from God and give it to myself. And we live in a world of forgetters, don't we? The amount of people in our culture who thank God or acknowledge Him or give Him any credit or any due, it's an awfully small number of people. How then do we make sure to remember where others forget? I believe the antidote to forgetting God is worship. Not only in Sunday morning at church, but worship as we've talked about it in the last 6 sermons, in our attitude, in our service to others, and yes, in that very countercultural practice of gathering together with our church family on a Sunday morning to worship Him in response and celebration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because in worship we give time to God, which others keep for themselves. In worship we give mindfulness, when we could allow ourselves to be preoccupied with all manner of important distractions. In worship, we give God credit that we might otherwise keep for ourselves. Folks, this passage in Deuteronomy is pivotal in the grand story of the whole Bible. The people of God are about to receive a tremendous blessing from Him, and the irony is this blessing may become the very reason they forget God. Can you imagine? And we know the rest of the story, don't we? We know that's exactly what happened to them. They take credit themselves, and they slowly forget to give credit to God. The challenge for us is to resist this very human trajectory. We have to remember. And we remember best when we force time into our calendar to do so. That's what I think. Not only on a Sunday morning at church, though that's a central healthy practice of the people of God, but daily in our activity and in our thought life, let us remember the good things that God has done for us. Amen.